Hello everyone, Sainter here, and welcome to the next part of my Religion for Games series. And today I've decided to deviate a little bit from my original plan and do more of a deep dive on deities, because I felt like, well, there's a lot of stuff that I had to cover in the previous episode. And I felt that deities kind of got a little bit of a short shrift, if that makes sense, because there's a lot here that's really important, and that has a lot of opportunity to build a lot of interesting mechanics around, a lot of interesting world building around, that I feel often is not fully explored or maybe gets a little bit neglected. So I'm going to go into a lot more detail, therefore, on deities. And when I say deities, I'm just using that as kind of a catch-all for supernatural entities or super powerful entities. So that could be something like, say, a superhero, kind of a low end sort of area, all the way up to a creator. And so there's a bunch of different things that I want to talk about. The first thing that I think is really important that I do want to emphasize is that these beings are characters. This is like really important. They are motivated individuals. They have goals. They have wants. They have desires. They may have needs. They may not exactly have needs, but on the upper end of power, it's definitely much more like writing a Superman type thing where you're trying to solve logical and moral dilemmas. The other thing that's really important is that these are probably going to be major characters, major players in the world setting, in their area, or it depends upon power level, but they're going to be major players. They may not be the main character of your story, but they are going to be major characters for your world. And it's really important to understand their role, their position, their influence, and what impact they are having on how your world works and how all of those things go. So I have a bunch of different things that I want to go into more details on. So I'm going to just go ahead and start with the power level question. How powerful are your deities? Now, keep in mind, you can have different tiers. There can be a hierarchy here. You can have some Grand Poobah deity that's like super powerful, creator tier. I'll explain why that's higher tier in a moment. And then you can have some that are much lower tier that are like local spirits or things like that, that have an influence on things and have their own little area, but maybe are not super powerful. But you do want to... for any individual character, you're going to need to assess sort of roughly what is their power level, how powerful are they, because it's going to determine things like what it is that they can do, what influence do they have, how much do people care about what they can do. You run into sort of the fear of power thing, which is when somebody has power over you, you fear them in the sense of what they can do. So, for example, if you think you're doing something wrong, or that if you think you're doing something that the police might punish you for, then you fear the police, and that fear produces results. A good example of this is if you know that a cop is behind you, you might drive a little bit more slowly than normal. You might take a slightly different pace for some of that stuff. So that's a fear of the police, a fear of their ability to punish you, a fear of their authority. That's sort of what the like fear of God, as it were. But that's going to apply to any sort of being that you create that has more power than a human being, or has power differentiated from what a human being's power is. Perhaps might be important. So we have, as I kind of established, there's sort of the low end, which I think superheroes kind of can belong in, where they have powers that are greater than a human being, but maybe not that much greater, but it can go quite high. So you have kind of local spirits. There's a couple of different ways that power can manifest. One of which is there a locality of power, i.e., is the spirit's power connected to a location, or this being's power, I should say, connected to a location, in which case maybe it wanes and decreases the further away from that location they go, or is it not? Is it just intrinsic part of them, or something that kind of goes broadly? That can have some varying power level. And that can create some really interesting mechanics as well, where you could have characters who draw power or are otherwise empowered, or even these characters themselves, where when you move, it changes their power and things like that. That could be really interesting. Or things where like the abilities a character is able to use shift from place to place because, this area, I have a relationship with this being, but their power decreases as we go here, and now I'm entering the domain of this other being, and now I have access to their power, and it's this sort of thing, and you can do some interesting stuff that way mechanically, I think. But you can also have domains of power. So this would be something like your traditional Zeus being a god of lightning. He has control over lightning, or like Thor or whatever. At least I'm not sure if that's accurate to the mythology, but it's certainly how we think of them. So having those domains of like, oh, this being can do crazy stuff with fire, but they can't do anything when it comes to water or whatever. So you can do different things like that. And that's a way of having a specific domain where they have a certain amount of power, but it's limited. So I think personally, I would describe a creator as the highest power, because the ability to create, in the ultimate sense, like create a universe, create a world, is incredibly high, and it means that you have ultimate authority over your creation. We as human creators have authority over our creations. We have power over them. And likewise, a divine being that was able to create. Now, you can have some variance in that. You can have competing creators. For example, you could have perhaps a group that of deities that came together to create the world, and then started having some factionalism where they each created different sentient beings and kind of, I don't know, horse raced with them or something. It was like, oh, we'll see whose beings do the best, and you can have stuff that way if you wanted to. But that fundamentally sets up the nature of the world, and that fundamentally sets up relationships of the world, where there's going to be, I don't know, elves and dwarves and men, or whatever you want to pick, orcs, it doesn't matter, where there's going to be inherent animosity there. For some inspiration on some of these relative power level things, you can actually look at Lord of the Rings stuff, because you have Iluvatar at the top, who created everything, and then you have kind of the, I forget if it's Vanar or what, but then you have the tier below that of participated in the acts of creation. They're kind of like archangel sort of thing. You can think of them that way. And then you have like the level below that, which is what I think Gandalf and Sauron are. And then down to like, here's the creation of elves and dwarves and men and orcs being twisted by Morgoth and all that stuff. So there's definitely things that you can look at if you feel like reading the Silmarillion for inspiration on some of the world building angles. But anyway, this power level is really important to establish, because it establishes not only what your deity can do and can't do, it also establishes sort of mechanical bounds for what it is that they could do, and mechanical bounds potentially if you're doing some like, okay, these are the worshippers of this deity, here's the things that they can do because of that relationship, and stuff like that. So that's some really important stuff to establish. Now, I mentioned as you get higher and higher in terms of raw power level, you begin more and more having to have the problems that your deity is trying to overcome, as it were, in their own personal motivation, their own personal story, be things that are more moral or logical in nature, because they're not challenged by ability to do things. They're challenged by what it is they want to do and how they're going to go about doing it. So, like I mentioned, a well-written Superman can be an example of some of the moral struggles. Things like, what is the right thing to do? What do I believe the right thing to do is? And how do I determine what it is? And how do I weigh things and determine what I think is best to do, and all that sort of stuff. So there's an element of that that can go on. There can also be logical things, though. Things like constraints based on their goals. So as an example, loosely, if a deity wanted to accomplish X thing, then anything that will prevent that from happening is something that they don't want to do. So let's say if your deity wants to, trying to pick some random example here, have trees grow really tall, maybe. They're going to want to do stuff that prevents the trees from not being able to grow tall, if that makes sense. It's a simplified example. And it's kind of an obvious one, but you can get really complicated with that. So, for example, if the deity wants people to have free will decision-making, then that deity is going to, and there could be many reasons why. Maybe they want something that's freely given, like, say, love, for example. If the deity wants people to love each other, love is something that has to be freely given, because if it's not freely given, it's not love. Love potions are proof of that. Therefore, the deity has to be careful to not violate free will, because if the deity violates free will, then to force people to love each other, that's no longer properly loving each other. So it's a whole mess, but that's a logical constraint, right? That's a logical constraint. And it's also important when you're thinking about this thing that you avoid worrying about nonsense. Like nonsense isn't a thing. Stuff that's inherently self-contradictory. That like if this thing can do thing X, can they do a thing that prevents them from being able to do thing X? Is like there, and there's other examples of that sort of stuff. That's like you can't have raw nonsense of this doesn't logically make sense. So yeah, just be aware of that. Another thing that's actually really important to discuss, especially on the upper ends of power level, is the being's relationship with time. And this goes into a couple of other things too, like how did the being or how did the being or beings come into existence? How did they begin? And the answer could be that they are eternal. They've always been there. At which point the relationship with time has to become very specific. Otherwise, you have origins that you're dealing with, and you have to think about, okay, how are they interacting with time? You might be able to sidestep this, but it's good to at least be aware of this. So what I mean by this is, if a being is eternal, that is, they do not have a beginning nor an end. And the key part here is they don't have a beginning, right? This is especially important for creator deities. If a creator deity has an origin, then that origin has to come from somewhere, right? So you get this sort of loop back effect, which has infinity problems. Again, you can hand wave it. You can always hand wave things if you want to, but it's stronger, I think, if you consider things. So, as an example, in Dark Souls, you have the Age of Ancients, right? How did the Age of Ancients start? Has it always been there? If so, what was the impetus for fire? All that sort of stuff. There's question marks about, okay, what is the actual origins of things here? And it sounds like the Age of Ancients just was, right? It's kind of presented as this just has been, right? And then somehow this impetus for fire happened. And that's a question of like, okay, that like it's hard to have time and have things. Its negative infinity is not a number, it's a concept. It means it goes forever in this direction, which means you can never count from negative infinity. You have to pick some discrete starting point. So an eternal being is a being then that supersedes time, so that way they don't have a starting point. They don't have an origin. They are bigger than time. This is really heady and difficult to kind of grasp, but just be aware that the relationship with time, if a being is eternal, or in some other way outside of, or can be outside of, the time frame for your standard beings, means that they can interact with time at different points and have predictive powers. And all of this goes into how you're handling time in the first place. It's important for creator deities. It's less important for non-creator deities. But if a deity is bound by time, if they do experience time in the way that we usually conceive of it, how do they come into being? What are their origins? And how has their existence changed reality? Those are some questions you might want to ask. You can get some interesting world building stuff that way of like, you have that fire. If that fire is a deity, that changed existence in the Dark Souls world, right? That first flame. And so you can begin asking questions about, okay, now that this has come into being, now that it's changed reality, that is the impetus for our story in Dark Souls. Without the first flame, there is no Dark Souls, right? I'm using that as an example because it's a useful one. But there's other ways that you can kind of approach that if you want to. And you could also have stuff that could be really interesting where maybe a being comes into existence partway through your story and that dramatically changes how the world works. And that could be something that's interesting to consider. So, okay. We next need to talk about what is their nature. And what I mean by this is, are they a physical being? Are they a spiritual being? If they're just a spiritual being, like purely spiritual or non-corporeal, as it were, they don't have inherently a physical, fleshy existence. Do they manifest somehow? If so, how? So there's useful stuff in all of these. A purely spiritual being is intrinsically very different from a physical being. A physical being is bound in location in a way that a spiritual being isn't. But a spiritual being may have difficulty communicating or influencing the physical world or things like that. And An example of a purely physical being could be a god king, for example, in the demigod sort of sense. They tend to be very physical, versus something that is more of a spiritual being that, say, manifests or can speak through statues of themselves or things like that. That kind of brings right into the next sort of aspect of what is their nature is how do they communicate. If they're a physical being, we know how physical beings communicate. We use speech, we write stuff down. I'm not left-handed, but we write stuff down, so I can't write properly. That's where I was going with that. We make pictures, act out stuff. There's, as I wildly gesticulate, there's different ways that we communicate, and different aspects to physical communication. But if it's a purely spiritual being and they don't have the ability to manifest into, and when I say manifest, I mean have a physical presence, have an observable presence, have a presence that we can visually identify or auditorily identify. So this could be something like creating a corporeal body with which to interact that is, there as a medium for them to convey through. Or another way of manifesting could be projecting a voice out of nowhere, or organized atmospheric effects and other things. There's different ways that you can kind of have manifestation occur. So if the being can't manifest and is purely spiritual, then communication becomes a real big question mark. So do they use like visions, dreams? Do they have some sort of other way, almost like a hallucination type thing? This is another question mark of like, how is communication happening? And you can also bring up the question of like, how is the player potentially communicating with these beings, if they are communicating with these beings? You could have interesting stuff built in with this of like, okay, well, this being is able to communicate this way, therefore we have to go do these things to be able to get information from them or to be able to interact with them in some way. And you can also have questions of like, are there prophets or other beings that they communicate with and stuff like that? Other corporeal, fleshly, physical beings that they are able to communicate with, who then communicate to other people. And then another similar but very different question is, what is their character? And when I say character, I mean character in the sense that we would use it kind of about each other. So like, what are their morals is a really good example. Then this is actually really, really, really important. The more powerful a deity is, or the more powerful anyone is, the more they have the ability to have their idea of morals and morality influence everyone else. So if you have high-powered deities, we'll get into involvement in a moment, which is also a very important part of this, but the way they, like, their moral viewpoint on the world and what they say right and wrong are, because morals are all relative. It's always in the eye of the beholder. And as your power increases, the more you're able to exert your moral will upon the world. And so deities are able to exert a lot of their moral will on the world if their power level is high enough. Now, that could be localized. So you could have a localized area of the deity has a lot of power in this area, and you can do stuff with that mechanically, where you could have some quirky little aspects of how the deity wants things run. And if your players run afoul of that, things go weird for them. There's design space there. I think that there's a lot of design space in deity enforced customs, if that makes sense, which is kind of what this goes into. But deities have the ability to exert their moral lens on things. If their power level, like the higher the power level goes, the more they can do that. So what are their morals? What do they say is right and wrong? And how does that influence the lives of the people who live under their sphere of influence? And that, to me, is a very interesting area to explore. In particular, you can do stuff like, say, if you loot treasure chests and houses in this part of the world, you start having problems happen because the deity is cursing you. And those problems go away if you leave their sphere of influence, but if you go into this area, you start having problems happen. And you can do interesting stuff like that. You can also have impacts on the followers of that character. Like, this is really important for building culture of the followers of this deity, is thinking about, okay, what are the morals of this deity, and then how do the people follow it? And then another really important question, kind of coming off of that, is how involved is this deity? How involved are they in the affairs of life? And a follow-up question to that is, how are they involved? So it's this fun little, how involved are they and how are they involved? But two very important connected questions, because a character could be very involved but very subtle, very behind the scenes, or they could be very hands-off. And if they're very hands-off, I mean, we're going to get to motivation a little bit more in just a second, but if they're very hands-off, why are they hands-off? And if they're very hands-on, why are they hands-on? And how do they go about doing their influence? Do they mostly just sit back and let people do things until somebody's trying to specifically interact with them? How are they interacting with things? How much influence are they choosing to have, and how do they express that influence? How overt is it? How subtle is it? You can do really interesting things this way, actually, mechanically. I think one of the more interesting concepts would be to adjust random probabilities based on sort of how much the deity likes you, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. So if you're displeasing to the deity, your random probabilities go down. You maybe get lower rolls on your damage rolls, and you don't critical hit as much, and you get afflicted by conditions more often. And it all depends upon what systems you have going on in your game, obviously. But things like, you're pleasing the deity, you're making the deity happy. That improves your random results. Imagine a tactics game where, your accuracy level behind the scenes gets adjusted by how much the deity of the area likes you, or things like that. You could do some interesting stuff that way, and encourage play in interesting ways. By letting players know that this deity doesn't like you, your luck is going down, or this deity does like you, your luck is going up. And I think that's an interesting sort of subtler way of being involved in that regard. And then probably the most important aspect of a deity, and I've written these things down in kind of a random order, but it's, what is their motivation? This is incredibly important, and I really want to emphasize this here. These deities that you're creating need to be characters with will and purpose and desire and motivations and things they're trying to accomplish. They need to be just as fleshed out of characters, in my opinion, as any of your other major players. So if you have an emperor, say, or a king or somebody who has a lot of influence on the setting, your deities need to also have a lot of influence on the setting. They need to also be very important. And this really matters a lot in the world building for creating a cohesive and powerful experience, in my opinion, in that their motivations, what they're wanting to accomplish, informs so much of the building of any sort of religion that is actually worshiping a real deity, right? You can do what you want with religions that aren't worshiping an actual deity, although I think it's useful to try to think about how people came up with whatever customs and rituals they have. But if you have an actual deity involved, and they are heavily and overtly involved, they're really going to influence things a lot. And it's really important to think about, what is their motivation? What are they trying to accomplish? What do they want? What are the intrinsic limitations? I mentioned this earlier, but what sort of limitations do they run into based on what they want? And what's required to accomplish that? How emotional are they? This goes back into their character. Are they going to be very logically driven? How are they setting their goals? How are they setting their desires? Are they very emotionally driven? Do they do things that seem irrational? Or are they very rational and logical in their processes? Are they going to, for example, what what we do, I think, when we work optimally is to set a goal based on some sort of emotional thing. What is something we desire? What is something we want? What is something that we'd like? And then logically figure out how to accomplish that. Because when we try to emotionally figure out how to accomplish that, it usually does not accomplish it very well. Because we usually do not think through all the consequences. We usually do not think about how we could self-sabotage. So, for example, we can do things that we think emotionally, like an emotionally driven way, will accomplish what it is that we want, but it ends up working against what we actually want. Things like that. So how does your deity operate? What is their motivation? How does that interact with things like miracles and power systems and world building of religion and all this sort of stuff? See, I'm trying to think of I probably, and this is going to be spoilers for Tales of Symphonia. So I'll come back to this one and go into Tales of Symphonia stuff. Let me go ahead and wrap up some of my other points that I want to get to, and then I'll come back to that one because I don't want to have to worry about figuring out timestamps. So, okay, so I'll come back to that. Another question, and I kind of brought this up earlier a little bit, but how many different deities are there? What sort of hierarchy is there? Is there a hierarchy? What are the relationships more broadly? We'll get into this in more detail in presumably the next episode when I talk about, not next episode, one after that, when I talk about religions confronting each other, because if there's different deities with different religions around them versus one religion with multiple deities in it, if there's one religion with multiple deities in it, there's probably some sort of hierarchy, some sort of order, some sort of structure. There are definitely relationships between those deities in some way, shape, or form, because if they're all under one umbrella religion, they have to have some point of commonality. If there's different religions with different deities and they all get along, that's a different sort of thing. You could do something like that if you have local deities. So, like, deities of this region, deities of that region, deities of this other region. They might all have a positive relationship with each other where they're trying to get along, which would contrast with, say, deities of this people group and deities of this people group that might be conflicting with each other. So there's thinking about sort of the hierarchies and relationships is very useful in the broad sense, which again we'll talk about when we talk about conflicting religions or religions coming in conflict with each other. But if it's one religion with multiple deities, thinking about what is the relationships. This can be things like parent-child relationships, or this could be like creator-created relationships. So, as an example, you have, back in the Lord of the Rings, I mentioned it earlier, you have Iluvatar at the top, who's kind of the grand creator, who then makes the Vanar, I want to say, but that has this sort of middle level that he makes, and has lower levels, and then they have things that they make. So you have sort of this tiered structure where, like, this group works together to kind of rule, and there's, like, different tiers in there and stuff like that. So there's different ways that you can approach this and different complexities where it's still one religion with different branches, and why are people going to one another? There's a lot of stuff to work out there. There's definitely a lot of room to, say, create a religion with different things where it's like, oh, if you're going after this thing, you do this. Like, Guild Wars 1 does this to an extent where it's like, oh, if you are a Mesmer, technically you're following after the twin goddesses of Lissa. If you're a warrior, you follow after Balthazar. If you're an elementalist, well, your fire magic is powered by Balthazar, your water magic is powered by Grenth, your energy storage is powered by Lissa, your air magic is powered by Dwayna. So there's, like, different affiliations here, and you can do interesting stuff with that potentially. The most Guild Wars does with that is if you go to a deity statue while out in an explorable zone, you can, and you have the favor of the gods. I'm not going to get into those systems right now, but you can get blessings that boost, like, your attributes related to that deity, for example, which is, I think, is in at least a little bit of a nod towards that affiliation, which I think is neat. But there's different things. Anyway, and then there's procreation of deities, which is really important. For example, are there rules around procreating? How weird is it? Like, emerging from a forehead. It's pretty weird. Does it need a mate? If so, what can be the mates? These are different things that are useful to contemplate, particularly when it comes to building that hierarchy, building different characters around. I think it's useful to consider how, if a deity procreates to make another deity, where is sort of what does that relationship look like? How does that change power levels or domains or things like that? Does it have an impact on it? If so, what? Is there like delegation that happens? How does that impact the religion? You could do some really interesting stuff that way, I think, in the middle of storytelling, and all that sort of stuff. But okay, so that's a lot about some of those. I wanted to get back to that motivation thing, though, and I think I'm going to kind of conclude on this because I want to use an example from Tales of Symphonia. So if you have familiarity with that game, or you don't care, but I'm going to be massive spoilers here. So I'm just going to say goodbye to everyone who wants to head out. That's fine. And let's go ahead and get into our example. So Tales of Symphonia has a religion built by Mythos Yggdrasil with the purpose of trying to create a host body for his sister Martel, who is dying. And he preserves Martel with the power of the seed of the world tree that is needed, or the mana tree or whatever, that's needed to have everything working. And so he creates a religion that worships the goddess Martel and sees his organization, Crucius. It's been a while since I played it. I'm trying to remember how to pronounce it. But has his organization, Crucius, that is controlling and manipulating the world, and has structures in place with the purpose of producing this cycle that generates hosts to attempt to host Martel. And so we have this character who's basically the effective de facto religious authority of Mythos. And he creates his religion with a very intentional purpose and very intentional motivation. And that motivation influences the way the story plays out and everything. It's an important part of that story and an important part of the narrative. But we can see that he has motivation. He has a goal. What is that goal? To preserve his sister's life and to basically find a vessel for her that she can continue to live with him. That's his goal. He wants his sister to be able to live with him forever, sort of thing. How does he go about doing that? Well, he ends up forming a religion. That religion has specific goals. It has specific rules about how it works, specific rituals that are all to support this operation. And so he's doing things with incredibly specific motivational goals. And it's a really good example of that goal setting and sort of your like the religious motivation of things and how all of that stuff plays together. And I also like the touch where he's basically worshiping his sister and makes her the goddess of his religion, which I think is pretty interesting. But that's a really good example of motivation and executing on that motivation, creating a plan of religion, following the desires of the deity of that religion, and all of that stuff, and how the world gets structured, literally structured around those desires. And that sort of incredibly powerful influence is reflective of the incredible power of that individual. And that's an example of how that world building can work. And understanding what those relationships could look like in a more positive light, or a different sort of setting, I think is really useful. But considering how the deities in your setting, in your world building, are influencing the world, affect the world, both at a world building level, at a narrative level, as well as at a mechanical level, I think is really useful and really important to do. And why, and this is a fundamental question I should have asked earlier, but oh well, here we are. Why does your deity, if they help the heroes, if they provide the power of miracles, why do they do it? What are they gaining? What is their motivation? And hopefully this has been an effective and helpful deeper dive into deities and into building these sorts of things. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here, I guess. I think I've kind of said what I want to. There are definitely different different ways that this can help flesh out worlds, help flesh out mechanical systems, create an interesting set of gameplay stuff in terms of how are players interacting with these deities, especially when these deities are being properly treated as characters, as individuals with motivations, goals, desires, and how that is reflected in world building and mechanical design around those sort of interactions. So however you'd make another character, just keep that sort of stuff in mind when creating a deity. And I hope to see some games with more fleshed out deities, more fleshed out religion systems, and all that sort of stuff. But I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. So until next time, everyone, take care. Goodbye.